together, so let's give it a go. He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. And then I'd love to share with you from Ephesians chapter 4. These are Paul's words. He writes, I therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beg you to lead a life worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, making every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. For there is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to the one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in all. So I have a question for you. Again, not a rhetorical question, and so it has been really fun to see all the different responses across the services this morning, and so probably the easiest question that you'll ever have, because we all like to eat, right? Okay. So here it is. So for those who are worshiping online, we'd love to hear from you too. So please comment and share with us your favorite. So what are some of your favorite places to eat in Sioux Falls? Taco Bell. Taco Bell. Faux Thai. Bread and circus. Okay, say that one again. Nam Phem. Okay, yes. Our Wine Bar. Azteca Mexican. Anybody else? Golden Bowl. Johnny Carino's. Okay, this is good news because it means that I could go out to lunch with any of you. So our family loves to eat out. It's one of our favorite things to do. But sometimes it takes a little while for the four of us to get on the same page. Has that ever happened to you? You're talking with maybe your partner or maybe your family or maybe a friend, and you just can't quite get on the same page of what you want for dinner, for lunch. And so for Christmas this past year, I bought my husband a restaurant dice. Evidently, everybody has this challenge because you can buy about 1 billion of them on Amazon. And so I bought him a restaurant dice, and on it has different kinds of foods. And so it's Italian, Mexican, American, seafood, and you just roll the dice, and it tells you what to go out and get or what to make at home. And I kind of got it mostly to be funny. I thought it would be kind of a fun gag gift, but I have to admit that there was a slice of hope in there for me that maybe it would help us those moments when we just couldn't agree on anything. You know, and that's what it's like being human in so many ways, that it's hard for us to find consensus. It's hard for us to find unity. Now, that's true in the small matters of life, like figuring out where you want to go to eat for lunch or dinner, and it's especially difficult in those larger, more significant, more important matters in life, too. Now, unity, it doesn't just happen. We don't stumble upon unity. Unity takes intentionality. Unity takes work. And I think oftentimes we're reminded of how fragile unity really is. How difficult it is to build, how challenging it is to maintain. We're reminded of that when we see unity start to break down. And I think that most of us have experienced this probably in a personal way. That maybe it's that friendship that has crumbled, or the family disagreement that you've had over an inheritance. Maybe it's a relationship or a business partnership, something that's ended unexpectedly, abruptly. Maybe it's a political and ideological difference that has just put strain on a relationship that's important to you. You know, I would imagine that all of us have probably experienced this in some way. And it's so hard when things we've grown to love, depend on, things that we thought would last, all of a sudden begin to fall apart. And often when we're in the middle of it, it can feel like it came out of the blue, it came out of nowhere, and we can't figure out why is this happening. But these events are rarely sudden. Almost always there's been fault lines existing underneath the surface for quite some time. Now, for the geologist in the room, in geological terms, a fault line, it's a fracture along which the Earth's crust has moved. It's seismic waves. They're generated on the two sides of the fault, and they rapidly slip past each other. And that's what causes earthquakes. And for most earthquakes, the fault lines, they don't even break the surface. They can only be seen through analyzing the seismic waves. They're often invisible, and until the earthquake strikes, sometimes we're not even aware of them. But then everything falls apart. Now, fault lines, they can be really hard to see. We can experience fault lines in our families. We can experience them in our relationships. We can experience them in our churches. We can experience them in our community, in our nation, and our world, because they're lying right there underneath the surface. Now, fault lines can happen for all kinds of reasons. I think sometimes they just happen because life is changing, and we don't always change in the same way. Fault lines, they can happen because we are imperfect people who live alongside other imperfect people. And it's when relationships begin to unravel, it's often those little hurts here and there, the things said, the things left unsaid, that over time make the fault lines begin to rupture. And that's what Paul's writing about in his letter to the Ephesians. That Paul can see these fault lines that are developing beneath the surface that have this potential to tear this fragile community of faith apart. After all, we know a little bit about the churches in Ephesus, that they were made up of different people. They were made up of people from both a Jewish background and also a Gentile background. And these folks didn't have a whole lot in common. What they held in common was their faith in Jesus. But it still made it tricky as they were building their new churches. You know, the folks with a Jewish background, they tended to want the Christian community in Ephesus to be a little more Jewish, that there were traditions that they held dear and things that they'd grown up with that they wanted to continue on in their new church. Now, likewise, the Gentiles, those with a Gentile background, they wanted their Christian community to be a little bit more Gentile, that they had traditions, they had things that they had grown up with that were important to them, that they wanted to see continue in the church. And so we can see how difficult this would have been and how these fault lines would have been developing beneath the surface and how hard it would have been for them to find unity with their differences. And so Paul writes a letter to them. Now, Paul sometimes can be a little direct. And we see this in his letter, that he says, I'm begging you to lead a life worthy of your calling, for you have been called by God. Always be humble and gentle. Be patient with each other, making allowances for each other's faults because of your love. Make every effort to keep yourselves united in the Spirit, binding yourselves together with peace. That Paul knows that unity's hard. Unity takes work. Unity requires intentionality because we have to have the right mindset so that we can build those healthy relationships that foster unity. And so Paul, he writes about being humble, being gentle, being patient, making allowances for each other's faults, that when we're humble, we put the needs of others as being just as important as our own needs. When we're gentle, we make an intentional effort to be kind and considerate in our interactions with others, that when we're patient, we slow down. Is that hard for anybody else? So hard to slow down, but that's part of what patience is. It's slowing down and giving people the benefit of our time and our attention, giving people the benefit of our understanding. Now, I think that this is maybe the hardest one, though, that Paul points out, that we make allowances for people's faults. That we make room for people to be people. We make room for people to be human, for people to make mistakes, for people not to be perfect. And that's sometimes really hard. But we know that all of these behaviors, they're undergirded by God's love. They're driven by the desire to love, driven by the desire to experience God's peace and God's unity. And so if we want to heal the current fault lines and prevent future ones, then we really do have to be intentional about being humble and gentle and patient and making room for people to be people as we build unity in our relationships and in our church, in our community, in our nation, in our world, because it doesn't just happen. Unity takes intentionality. It takes work. I think we see this all the time in the news and in history, but I was kind of reminded of this week. I ran across an old article about Steve Jobs. Now, Steve, of course, was a pivotal person in co-founding Apple. They founded it in 1976, and under his leadership, it just grew like crazy, and they began revolutionizing the personal computing world with products like the Apple Macintosh. And he wasn't alone, that there were other people who were joining him in this technology revolution. But Jobs, he was very creative, he was very bold, he was, I think, very aggressive at times, and sometimes that created challenges with those that he worked with, especially those in leadership. He was so intense that I think most of us know that he actually wore a black turtleneck every day because he didn't want to waste his creative energy on having to decide what to wear. He had this intensity and brilliance, but sometimes that created some challenges, and it led to creative differences and business disagreements and struggles over control, and we see all of these things bubbling under the surface, those fault lines. Well, finally, by 1985, he was out. This company that he had founded, they forced him out. Now, it probably seemed like a sudden breakup to those on the outside, but those on the inside knew that it was years and years of unresolved tension and conflict that had led to this place. Now, thankfully, their story, it doesn't end there, though. That with time and reflection and growth and maturing, Jobs was actually able to return to Apple. He came back in 1997. And you think about the new technological revolution that happened since then, that some of the products that we have in our pockets or in our homes, like the iPad and the iPhone and the iPod, which feels really old now, but he came back, and they were able to reconcile. They were able to be restored. Just like our personal relationships, unity, it takes work. It takes work in professional partnerships. It takes work as a country. It takes work as a world. And it's often those fault lines that we don't notice, that we're not paying attention to, that remain unaddressed, that eventually lead to the breakdown. But there's good news, because there's always the potential for reconciliation, and there's always the potential for restoration, especially when both parties are willing to work toward healing, to work towards restoration, especially with the wounds that caused the fracture. We know that oneness was not only important to Paul, that it was important to Jesus. Now, we've talked about this in past weeks, how Jesus, he prays right before his death and resurrection that we as Christians will be one, because he knows that we are going to struggle with this. And so then we see Paul talking about the same thing, that unity, it's critical to our witness as Christians. But unity, it doesn't mean that we will experience uniformity, because people will always be different. That was true in the churches in Ephesus. That's true in our church, even today, that we have different backgrounds, different gifts, different life experiences, different viewpoints. Now, Paul, he wasn't asking the Christians in Ephesus to downplay or to deny their differences. In fact, he was asking them to use your differences to build up the body of Christ together. We are living in a season of heightened division. We all know that, where polarization just feels like it just keeps increasing. So may this be the time where we as followers of Christ can work towards unity, where we can work to recognize that our differences make us stronger, that we can work together, especially here at First United Methodist Church, to bring hope, love, and encouragement to others because of our faith. I have to admit that I have several favorite days of the week. This is one of them, but my other favorite day of the week is Wednesday. I love Wednesdays. And Wednesdays are really crazy around here. Has anybody experienced a Wednesday recently? Wow, I love it. It is chaos. But what's the best part is that we have people coming together from all different ages and who some drive in from Harrisburg and Brandon and some walk to church and we have just this beautiful, diverse group of people that come together to eat at our Wednesday night meal. Then we go and we sing together in our choirs, or we go to Bible study together, or we go to youth group, or we go to Kids Connect. And then sometimes we even do crazy things like food giveaways in our parking lot. This past week, we had our monthly food distribution with Feeding South Dakota, and we were given the privilege to serve 400 families together. I think, oh, thanks, yeah. That was awesome, yeah. And what's the neatest part is it takes about 25 people to do this. And I can tell you that the 25 people, before we started doing this, they didn't know each other. Because people go to different services, they hang out with different groups, they know different people. But now they know each other. And not only do they serve together, they also go out for pizza afterwards every single month. That's the power of Christ bringing us together, of living out that shared mission and vision, of being a sanctuary of Christian hope, love, and encouragement in the heart of Sioux Falls together. That's what unity looks like. I think sometimes we think that unity has to be these big things. And then we wonder, well, if I can't do something big, can I do something at all? But I think often unity starts in the smallest of steps. So we're going to do something to take one of those steps together today. And we don't often do this in this way in this service, but we're going to share the peace of Christ together right before we celebrate communion. And so I'll show you what that looks like. May the peace of Christ be with you and also with you. Got it? Really easy. Now, this has been something that Christians have done for a really, really long time. But one of the theological reasons is to be reminded that we are united in Christ, that Christ brings us together with all of our differences because we are all God's children. So I'm going to invite you to do this, but here's just a little bit edge of challenge. I'm going to encourage you to share the peace of Christ with somebody you do not know, or somebody that you don't know well. You might not even know their name. And we're going to give you a little time to do this, but to share the peace of Christ together, and then we'll come back together and share in Holy Communion. Sorry, does that work? All right, let's do it. Well, it is so good to be together.